There is a saying among the old scribing houses of Earth, passed down long before humans ever left their solar system. Paper remembers what people conveniently forget. Nobody on the alien world of Ossivar Prime had ever heard that saying. If they had, the Council of the Thornspire might have thought twice before letting a human sit in the corner of their private chambers for 381 days. Her name was Wren Aldous, and she was, by every metric the nobility cared about, nothing at all. She was a scribe, third-class human. That last word did most of the damage on its own, at least on Ossivar Prime, where humanity was a newly arrived species, with no fleet, no empire, and no seat at any table that mattered. The alien nobles who ruled from the Thornspire were tall, silver-skinned, long-lived things called the VES, and they had a particular gift for looking straight through anyone they considered beneath their notice: servants, scribes, especially scribes. Wren had been assigned to the royal court 11 months before the story really begins, back when the old king still breathed, back when his daughter, Queen Isolde de Ossivar, was barely 19 years old and freshly crowned, and grief still sat in the corners of the palace like dust that nobody had bothered to sweep. Wren had lost someone, too, once, a long time ago back on Earth, a partner, a fellow archivist, killed in a records hall fire that was ruled an accident and never fully investigated. She did not talk about it. She had learned in the years since that grief was easier to carry if you gave your hands something precise and repetitive to do. Recording words, cataloging facts, keeping things exactly as they had been said, so that no fire, no convenient accident, no passage of time could quietly erase them. So, when the Ossivar court needed a human scribe fluent in Veskar formal dialects, cheap, disposable, and beneath the dignity of anyone who mattered, Wren Aldous took the job without hesitation. She sat at a podium in the corner of the council chamber, a small raised desk with an ink-stylus and a ledger bound in gray leather, and she wrote down everything that was said in the Queen's private council, every session, every vote, every whispered aside that a noble thought too quiet for the human girl in the corner to catch. They were wrong about that every single time. The council chamber of the Thornspire was a vast dome of black stone and veined crystal, lit from above by a shaft of captured starlight that the Veskar considered sacred, a reminder that their ancestors had once been navigators before they became rulers. Beneath that shaft sat a long curved table of 9 seats, each for the ranking nobles of the great houses, and one, at the head, for the queen. Isolde de Ossivar was small for a Veskar, sharp-featured with pale violet eyes that had not yet learned to hide what she felt, which her father's advisors considered her greatest weakness. She had inherited a throne built for a war hero, and inherited it far too young, and the 8 nobles around that table had spent the better part of a year testing exactly how far they could push her before she pushed back. Before Wren watched all of it from her podium in the corner. Nobody looked at her twice. Lord Caedthren, head of House Thren, the oldest and wealthiest of the great houses, had a way of leaning back in his chair whenever the Queen spoke, as if her words were a light breeze he could afford to ignore. He had told her, in the 4th month of her reign in this very chamber, that House Thren would always stand as her sword and shield, that his loyalty to the Ossivar line was absolute and unshakable. Wren had written that down. To do. Word for word. Sword and shield, absolute and unshakable. 6 weeks later, in a private session, Thren believed was off the ledger because he'd waved the human scribe out of the room, not realizing she'd simply moved her podium to the antechamber where the acoustics carried every syllable through the old stone. He had told 2 other lords that the Queen was, in his words, a child playing at governance, and that House Thren would be wise to hedge its position. Wren had written that down, too. She always wrote it down. That was the quiet truth. Nobody in the Thornspire had bothered to notice. The Veskar nobility operated on a code of spoken honor where a promise given aloud was supposed to bind a house for a generation. They trusted their own memories, their own oral records, curated and repeated by court historians, who were, without exception, Veskar themselves, and who understood, without ever being told outright, Which memories were convenient to keep sharp, and which were convenient to let go soft and vague with time. A human girl with a ledger was not part of that system. She was furniture, a tool for producing the official transcript that got filed away and never read again. Nobody imagined she might actually be listening. For nearly a year, Wren filled ledger after ledger with the private promises of the Thornspire's ruling houses. Not just Thren, all of them. Lady Saren Voss had sworn, kneeling, that her house would support the Queen's grain tariff reform for the border provinces. The one policy Isolde cared about more than any other because it meant food for the human refugee settlements that had sprung up on the edges of Viascar territory since Earth's diaspora fleet arrived. 2 months later, Lady Voss voted against that same reform in full council, citing concerns she had never once raised in private. Lord Bryn Calor had promised the Queen, in a moment of apparent grief-shared kinship shortly after her father's funeral, that he would never move against her line, that he owed the old king a debt only loyalty could repay. 4 months after that, he was overheard suggesting, quietly, to Lord Thren that a regency council might serve the Thornspire better than an unproven girl on the throne. Wren wrote it all down. Every contradiction, every reversal, every promise made under starlight and broken in shadow. She dated each entry. She cross-referenced them. She built, without anyone noticing, without anyone caring to notice, a complete and merciless record of exactly how little the word of the great houses was worth. She did not do this because she loved the Queen. She barely knew the Queen, not as a person. She did it because it was her job to write down what was said, and because somewhere in the deep, unhealed part of her that still grieved a fire nobody had properly investigated, Wren Aldis had come to believe, with a conviction she rarely spoke aloud, that the truth deserved to survive even when the powerful wanted it to quietly disappear. She kept her ledgers in a locked case beneath her podium. She told no one, not the palace guards, not the other human staff, not even Queen Isolde herself. Isolde, for her part, barely registered the scribe's existence at all. She had bigger problems. 8 great houses that circled her like patient predators, testing her, waiting for the moment her grief-soft grip on the throne finally slipped. That moment, the council believed, had finally arrived on a gray morning in the 12th month of her reign. The chamber was colder than usual that day, and the light through the crystal dome had a flat, wintry quality that made the black stone walls look like the inside of a tomb. All 8 lords were present. That alone told Isolde something was wrong. Full attendance in private council was rare, reserved for matters the houses considered existential. Lord Thren stood first. He always stood first. He spoke of instability. He spoke of a treasury strained by the Queen's refugee settlements, of border skirmishes she had failed to crush decisively, of a young monarch who led with sentiment where her father had led with strength. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every word was carefully constructed to sound like sorrowful duty rather than naked ambition. He proposed a vote to depose Queen Isolde Vio Savar, and to install a regency council of the 8 great houses, until, as he delicately phrased it, a more seasoned hand could be found for the throne, whether that hand belonged to a distant cousin of the royal line, or, unspoken but understood by everyone in that chamber, to House Thren itself. Isolde felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move, did not flinch, did not let the violet of her eyes betray the cold drop in her chest. She had known this day might come. She had simply hoped she'd have more time to build the alliances her father would have known how to build in his sleep. One by one, the lords rose to speak in favor of the vote. Lady Voss spoke of fiscal responsibility, using almost the exact words she'd used 4 months earlier while explaining her betrayal on the grain tariffs. Lord Calor spoke of respect for the old king's legacy, a legacy he claimed the Queen was squandering, the same king whose memory he had once invoked to swear eternal loyalty to her line. 5 more lords rose. 5 more polished, sorrowful, entirely rehearsed speeches about duty and stability, and the painful necessity of change. Isolde sat very still at the head of the table, her hands folded in front of her, and for the first time since her coronation, she understood with total clarity that she was going to lose her throne in this room, today. surrounded by men and women who had sworn to protect her and had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to stop. Nobody in that chamber looked at the corner. Nobody ever looked at the corner. Wren Aldis sat at her podium exactly where she always sat, ink-stylus in hand, gray ledger open in front of her, doing exactly what she always did, recording, word for word, every syllable of the coup unfolding 6 feet from her chair. Her hand did not shake. It never shook. That was the strange, quiet gift grief had given her over the years. An ability to keep working, keep documenting, keep the pen moving no matter what horror unfolded in front of her, because the alternative, stopping, letting the moment go unrecorded, felt like a second death on top of the first. She had transcribed 381 days of council sessions. She had watched this exact group of people, one by one, hand the Queen a promise like a coin and then quietly pick her pocket 6 weeks later. She had written down every single instance, not because she planned this moment. She hadn't. She had simply never been able to stop herself from writing down the truth, because that was, in the end, the only thing she had ever really known how to do with grief. But sitting there, watching Lord Thren call for the formal vote, watching the Queen's hands tighten almost imperceptibly in her lap, something in Wren shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. There was no swelling music in her head, no sudden burst of courage from nowhere. It was quieter than that, and colder, and far more certain. It was the simple arithmetic realization that she was the only person in this room who actually knew what these 8 lords had said, in full, across an entire year, and that the ledger beneath her podium was not just a record, it was a weapon. And it was the only one in the room that the Queen had. Lord Thren called for the vote to begin. 8 lords prepared to raise their hands in favor of deposing a 19-year-old queen whose only real crime had been trying to feed refugees and grieve her father at the same time. Wren Aldis stood up. She had never once stood up during a council session. In 381 days she had been a fixture, a piece of furniture with a pen, and the sound of her chair scraping back against the black stone floor was loud enough that every head in the chamber turned toward the corner at once, as if the corner itself had suddenly grown a voice. Lord Thren's expression flickered, first with confusion, then with the particular contempt the Veskar reserved for servants who forgot their place. "This is a closed council," he said. "The scribe will sit down." Wren did not sit down. "With respect, my lord," she said, and her voice came out level and clear, carrying easily across the dome the way voices did when the speaker had spent a year learning exactly how sound moved through that black stone. "The transcript of this council is not complete until the record is read into it. That has always been the rule. I am simply doing my job." A few of the lords exchanged glances. It was technically true. The formal procedure of the Thornspire required that any vote of existential consequence, a deposition, a war declaration, a change of succession, be preceded by a reading of relevant council record into the official transcript. It was an old rule, a ceremonial one, rarely invoked, because rarely had anyone in that chamber had a reason to invoke it. Nobody had ever expected the human scribe to be the one to invoke it. Lord Thren's jaw tightened, but procedure was procedure, and the great houses of Ossivar prided themselves, at least in public, on respecting their own ancient forms. To deny the reading now, in front of the full council, would look like exactly what it was, an attempt to hide something. "Fine," he said, with the tone of a man swatting away an insect he assumed would tire itself out quickly. "Read your record, scribe. Then we vote." Wren opened her ledger. She had marked the pages already, weeks ago, months ago, without ever consciously admitting to herself why she was marking them, why she kept returning to certain entries and folding down the corners of certain pages, why some quiet, unnamed part of her had been building toward exactly this moment long before she understood what it was preparing her for. She began with Lord Thren, 4th month of the Queen's reign, 3rd day, she read, her voice steady, unhurried, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Lord Cod Thren, before the full council, quote, House Thren stands as your sword and shield. Majesty, my loyalty to the Ossivar line is absolute and unshakable in this generation and the next." End quote. She turned a page. 6th month, 17th day. Private conversation. Antechamber. Overheard during transcript relocation. Lord Thren to Lord Callar and Lady Voss. Quote, "The Queen is a child playing at governance, but House Thren would be wise to hedge its position before her mismanagement drags the rest of us down with her." End quote. The chamber had gone very quiet. Wren did not look up. Quote, she kept her eyes on the ledger, her voice flat and precise, a scribe simply reading a transcript, nothing more, and that flatness was, in its own way, more devastating than any accusation could have been, because it left no room for anyone to claim she was exaggerating, editorializing, lying. She was reading. Just reading. 9th month, 2nd day, she continued. Full Council, Lord Thren, in response to the Queen's proposal on border garrison funding, quote, "You have my word. This House will match whatever the Crown commits coin for coin, soldier for soldier." End quote. She turned another page. 11th month, 30th day. House Thren's actual contribution to the border garrison fund, as recorded in the Treasury ledger co-signed by Lord Thren's own steward, 0. A low murmur moved through the chamber. Lord Thren's silver skin had gone a shade paler, his mouth opening then closing, as if he could not decide which of the 4 accusations to deny first, and had realized, a half-second too late, that denying any of them meant admitting the ledger existed and was accurate. Wren did not pause for him. She turned to Lady Voss. 2nd month, 22nd day, she read. Lady Saren Voss, kneeling before the Queen following the death of King Ossivar the Elder. Quote, "Your father fed my house when famine took the eastern provinces 2 generations ago. I will support the grain reform in his memory and yours, Majesty, whatever it costs House Voss." End quote. 6th month, 9th day. Full Council vote on the border grain tariff reform. Lady Voss voting record, opposed. Cited reasoning, fiscal caution never previously raised. Lady Voss's hand rose slightly from the table, as if to object, and then simply hovered there, unable to find the words that would make the contradiction disappear. Wren turned to Lord Callar. 3rd month, 5th day. Private session, following the state funeral. Lord Bren Callar to the Queen directly. Quote, "I owe your father a debt only loyalty can repay. I will never move against your line, Majesty, not while I draw breath." End quote. 10th month, 14th day. Overheard corridor outside the Treasury chamber. Lord Callar to Lord Thren. Quote, "A Regency Council would serve the Thornspire better than an unproven girl. The old king's debt does not extend to his daughter's incompetence." End quote. One by one, Wren moved down the table. Every lord who had risen that morning to speak so eloquently of duty and stability found their own words from months earlier read back to them in a calm, unhurried voice, followed immediately by the contradiction that made every word of it a lie. She read Lord Ashraven's promise of unconditional support for the Queen's judicial reforms, followed by his vote against them 8 weeks later. She read Lady Corinthale's tearful vow at the coronation that she would guide the young Queen as a second mother, followed by a private remark, overheard in the chamber's antechamber, calling Isolde a puppet no wiser than a child playing dress-up in her father's crown. She read promise after promise, betrayal after betrayal, an entire year of the great house's true character laid bare in their own recorded words, unable to be denied because every single quote carried a date, a location, and, in several cases, the names of other lords present to witness it. Nobody in the chamber moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of ledger pages turning and the level, unhurried voice of a woman nobody had ever thought worth listening to. Isolde sat at the head of the table, and something in her posture had changed without her quite noticing it happen. Her spine had straightened. Her hands, folded in her lap, had gone still in a way that was not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone watching. For the first time in a year, the ground beneath her enemies crumbled instead of her own. Wren reached the last page she had marked. She closed the ledger, gently, the sound of it shutting unnaturally loud in a room that had gone that silent. That concludes the relevant record, my lords, she said. Per procedure, the transcript is now complete. You may proceed to your vote. Nobody proceeded to anything. Lord Thren was the first to find his voice, though it came out thinner than before, stripped of its earlier certainty. This is irrelevant theater, he said. Private remarks taken out of context do not change the substance of our concerns regarding the Queen's fitness to rule. With respect, my lord, Wren said, and there was something in the quiet precision of her tone now, something almost gentle, almost sorrowful, that made the words land harder than any shout could have. I have simply read the Council's own words. Back to the Council. I have added nothing. I have removed nothing. If the substance of your concerns survives contact with your own promises, then perhaps it is substance after all. But if it does not, my lord, then perhaps it was never substance to begin with, only convenience. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that exists only in rooms full of powerful people who have just been shown in front of their peers that they cannot trust each other because every single one of them now understood a simple, devastating truth. If Wren had a full year of Thren's contradictions on record, she likely had a full year of everyone's. Nobody in that chamber could be certain their own private words, spoken in what they'd believed were unguarded moments, weren't sitting in that gray ledger too, waiting. Lady Voss was the one who broke first. She had built her reputation on fiscal caution, on being the reasonable voice among the great houses, and the thought of her broken vow to a dead king being read aloud in some future session, perhaps at a moment even less convenient than this one, was more than her pride could risk. I withdraw my support for the vote, she said quietly. Lord Calor followed almost immediately, his own voice tight. As do I. One by one, like a wall losing its stones from the bottom up, the Council's unified front collapsed, not because they had suddenly discovered loyalty to their queen, not because Wren's words had moved their hearts. They collapsed because they had just watched, in real time, exactly how thoroughly they could be exposed, and every single one of them chose self-preservation over solidarity, the moment solidarity stopped being safe. Lord Thren remained standing a moment longer than the others, his hands braced against the table, his composure cracking at the edges. He looked at Wren, and for the first time in 381 days he actually saw her, not the furniture in the corner, not the disposable human scribe, but a woman who had been sitting 6 feet away from every private conversation he'd ever had in that chamber, writing down every word for an entire year, while he never once thought to lower his voice. You had no right, he said. I had a ledger, my lord, Wren said, and a job. I did both. He did not call for the vote again. He knew, as clearly as everyone else in the room now knew, that it would fail, and that forcing the issue would only invite Wren to open her ledger further, to more pages, to more names, to consequences none of them could predict or control. The council chamber emptied in silence over the following minutes, lords filing out, one by one, without their usual parting words, without the small performative courtesies they normally exchanged with the Queen. There was no triumph in their exit. There was only the particular quiet of people who had gambled on being unwatched and had just discovered, far too late, that they never had been. When the last of them was gone, only Isolde and Wren remained in the vast black chamber, the shaft of starlight from the crystal dome falling now on an empty table where a coup had failed to happen only minutes before. Isolde did not move from her chair for a long moment. She was 19 years old and had just watched, in complete silence. A human scribe do more to protect her throne in 10 minutes than any noble ally had managed in an entire year of careful politics. Why? Isolde finally asked, her voice smaller than the formal cadence she usually held in council. Did you keep those records at all? Nobody asked you to. Wren considered the question honestly before she answered it. She thought of the fire back on Earth, the one that took someone she loved and left behind an official report with too many convenient gaps in it, gaps that nobody with power had ever bothered to explain because the person who died hadn't been powerful enough to matter. She thought of how much she would have given in the aftermath of that loss for one honest, complete, unerasable record of exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. Because someone should always have the true record, Majesty, Wren said. even when nobody thinks to ask for it, especially then. Isolde studied her for a long moment, this quiet human woman who had spent a year being invisible in the most literal structural sense, dismissed by an entire aristocracy too arrogant to imagine that a scribe might be listening, might be remembering, might one day matter more than any sword in the Thornspire's armory. "They never even looked at you," Isolde said half to herself. "No, Majesty," Ren agreed. "They never did." There was no bitterness in the way she said it. There was, if anything, a kind of quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally found a room where that underestimation could be turned, precisely, patiently, into something that mattered. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened in the private council spread through the Thornspire in the careful half-whispered way that scandal always spreads among people who cannot admit, publicly, that it happened at all. The 8 great houses did not speak of the failed vote. They could not, without admitting their own contradictions, had been the reason it failed. But the palace staff knew. The guards knew. And slowly, unmistakably, the way people moved around, all this began to change. The nobles who had once walked past her podium without a flicker of acknowledgement now nodded to her carefully, the way one nods to a loaded weapon left visible on a table, a mixture of respect and unease that no human scribe had ever been given in the Thornspire's long history. Queen Isolde made no grand public announcement, elevating Ren's status. That they both understood without needing to discuss it would have drawn exactly the wrong kind of attention, would have turned a private ledger into a public target, would have invited the great houses to find some legal or violent way to neutralize the woman who now held their contradictions on paper. Instead, the change was quieter, more permanent, and in its own way, more powerful. Ren's podium was moved from the corner of the chamber to a position just to the left of the throne, close enough that the queen could turn and speak to her directly, close enough that every lord in that room understood, without a word ever being said about it, that the scribe was no longer furniture. She was witness. She was memory. She was the one thing in that chamber that could not be charmed, bribed, or intimidated into forgetting. Lord Thren never moved against the queen again, not openly. He grew, if anything, unnervingly polite in council, his old confident sprawl replaced by a careful, measured formality that never quite masked the wariness in his eyes whenever Ren's stylus moved across a fresh page. He had learned, in the most humiliating way, a proud man can learn anything. That some threats did not announce themselves with armies or blades. Some threats simply waited in the corner of a room, taking notes until the moment their patience finally paid for itself. The other lords learned similar lessons at similar paces in the months that followed. The Council of the Thornspire did not become honest overnight. Some habits of ambition ran too deep for that. But it became, for the first time since Isolde's coronation, careful, cautious, aware that every promise made under that crystal dome might one day be read back, word for word, in a voice too calm to argue with and too accurate to deny. Isolde Veosivar kept her throne. She grew into it slowly, the way anyone grows into a role too large for them at first, learning from her father's old advisors, from her own mistakes, and increasingly, from a human scribe who had shown her, in the space of 10 unbearable minutes, that the truth, patiently kept and precisely delivered. Ren Aldis kept her ledger. She still sat at her podium every council session, still wrote down every word spoken in that chamber, still filled page after page in the same careful, patient hand she had used for 381 days before anyone thought to notice her. She did not gloat. She did not remind the lords of what she had done. Did not need to, because the ledger itself, sitting closed and unassuming beneath her podium, did all the reminding required. Some evenings, after council adjourned and the great chamber emptied into silence, Isolde would linger at the head of the table, and the two of them, queen and scribe, would sit together for a while in the fading starlight, saying very little, needing to say very little. Isolde had learned, in the aftermath of nearly losing everything, that the most valuable ally in her court was not the loudest voice or the sharpest blade, but the quietest one, the one who had been in the room the entire time, watching, remembering, waiting for the truth to matter. And on earth, If anyone had bothered to look, they would have found records of 100 other scribes, just like Reynald is scattered across the diaspora fleet's diplomatic postings. In Veskar courts and Threl assemblies and Korathi trade councils, all of them quiet, all of them overlooked, all of them keeping their own patient, unglamorous ledgers of exactly what the powerful people around them had promised and exactly what they had done instead. Nobody had trained them for revolution. Nobody had sent them out with any weapon more dangerous than ink and patience. But across a dozen alien courts that had welcomed human scribes, precisely because they seemed too insignificant to matter, a quiet truth was slowly taking root, one page at a time. Paper remembered what people conveniently forgot. And somewhere in the vast indifferent dark between the stars, humanity had discovered that the most dangerous thing it could bring to a council of arrogant nobles was not a fleet or a weapon. It was a witness who never stopped writing. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, there are more tales like it waiting for you. Stories of the overlooked and underestimated, finding the moment that changes everything. So make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Ren's confrontation and which line hit you the hardest. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars. And remember, the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one keeping the truth alive.